Ann told me you'd be sure to wear gloves. And okay, we're going to be making Advent wreaths. We're going to be planting pansies. I love that there's so much is happening, and we are moving very close to Advent. Let me welcome you tonight. We have a wonderful group of you here. As you know, this is the next to the last of our winter semester, fall semester. I've been working on Philippians, and I want to just take a moment and alert you as to what we're going to do next. There's a page on your table. If maybe before the lights go completely out, I can call your attention to it. For the 5 Wednesdays from the beginning after Christmas until the beginning of Lent, we have invited 5 ministers from our community here to come and speak to us about their particular approach to the Christian faith. Denson came up with this wonderful metaphor of other rooms in God's house. One of the most familiar things Jesus ever said was, "In my Father's house are many dwelling places, many rooms." If you're King James, many mansions is the way it was translated. But the truth is that the church is a vast, vast cathedral with lots of different rooms around the whole side, and no one of us has an absolute lock on the whole truth. And so this is an effort to try to open us up to other expressions of the body of Christ. When I was in my Baptist incarnation, we used to laugh at the biggest surprise some Baptists were going to have when they got to heaven was to find there was anybody else up there beside them. And of course, pray God there will be. I heard once about a Quaker. Quakers are a very small group, 160,000 worldwide. They've had tremendous influence, particularly in social issues. Probably had more to do with the abolition of slavery than any other single group. And I heard that somebody asked, a Quaker once said, "Is there going to be anybody in heaven beside you all?" And he said, "Well, there better be. It won't pay him to keep the place open." Now that's a much more humble and ecumenical attitude, but there will be many brothers and sisters, and we're going to have 5 people to come. Seventh-day Adventist. Sam Pettigrew is a dear friend of mine. He is at the Sardis Baptist Church, which is a wonderful national Baptist church. It was one of his colleagues that was killed recently because he was trying to do something about the drugs. We're having the Greek Orthodox father. We're having someone from the Unity Church, and then from the Unitarian Universalists. But there are going to be 5 talks like I have tried to do after supper beginning on the 8th of January. And I hope that will offer us a true ecumenical broadening of our perspectives, and it will give us a chance to know that in God's great church we are by no means alone, but are linked together with lots of other people. I'm delighted you came tonight. If you're visiting, I hope you found a real welcome at your table. We're glad to share this particular experience with you. And I invite you, as we grace our gathering, to bow with me in a moment of prayer. Dearest God, as flowers instinctively turn and open to the sun, knowing their need and knowing their source, so we in this moment turn our hearts toward you in openness. You know us better than we know ourselves, and you want for us better things than we deserve or that we could even conceive. Therefore, let your grace do its work. Let your love cast out fear. Let your hope take deep root in the very deepest places of our lives. And may we learn this night, and may we grow, and may this contribute to your great desire to make us full and complete in your image. All this we ask through Christ our Lord. Amen. I mentioned the very first night that we began this study of Philippians that this short little letter that Paul wrote is really one of the most influential and one of the most quoted of all the parts of the New Testament. At least 60% of the verses that you find in these 4 short chapters are used somewhere in our 3-year lectionary cycle those of you who are Episcopalians know that every 3 years the major portions of Holy Scripture are proposed to be read in our services, and about 60% of the 105 verses that comprise this particular letter find their way into our lectionary reading. And as I said that first night, some of the most famous passages in all the New Testament, some of the most familiar words are to be found there. And tonight, for our 9th lesson, I want to devote our attention to just 2 verses, but they're verses that I'm sure are very familiar to many of you. I'm sure you've heard them spoken about. I'm sure you have read them many times. And they do represent something very, very significant. Paul says, "Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there be any excellence, if there be anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you have learned, received, and seen in me, do, and the God of peace will be with you." Before I begin, just a careful look at these 7 qualities that St. Paul identifies, I would just point out again something that I've made reference to before, and that is this particular passage begins with yet another "finally." We have noticed that Paul seems to come to conclusions again and again and again in this letter. It reminds me of Victor Borg. Are you familiar with this musician, comedian? He has a gig where he's really a very wonderful musician, but he's playing this classical sounding piece of music. And you think he's going to end because it comes to the kind of climax we're used to, and then he'll start off, and it goes on and on and on and on until it is absolutely hilarious. And this is the 3rd time in the space of 10 verses that Paul says, "Finally." Now, we can come to one or 2 conclusions. Either what we have here is a collection of different letters, which is probably the deepest truth. In all probability, Onesimus, who was the bishop of Ephesus, who was the runaway slave that Paul took mercy on, helped convert, and then sent the letter back to Philemon to ask that he be accepted. When he was collecting these letters from the man that had meant so much to him, he may have well taken at least 3 different communications from Paul to the church in Philippi and simply put it together later on because they were all addressed to the same church. And that would explain why there is abrupt seams in the texture of the text, and why again and again he seems to be coming to a conclusion. The other alternative, of course, is that news would come back and forth from where he was in Rome, from the Philippian church, and he would be writing, and then some news would break, and so he would add his comments on that. And it really doesn't make any difference in terms of the interpretation, whether you see this as a compilation of 3 little short letters or whether you see it as one. But it is interesting that again and again in this letter he seems to be about to finish, and then he doesn't. Anne tells me that I have the bad habit of saying in closing and then go on for 15 more minutes. And I heard once about a minister who had that terrible, terrible temptation, and he would say, and in conclusion, and then he goes on, and suddenly he looks on the pulpit and he sees his watch, and he shakes it and says, "Oh my goodness, I didn't realize that my watch seems to have stopped." And somebody out there said, "I've got a calendar if it'll do any good." I sometimes feel like that's what I need to say to Paul here in relation to all of his finalies. But once again, he is summing up at least a portion of his thought. And my hunch is that what we have here is really 3 different letters that he wrote on different occasions. Now, before I begin to deal with the 7 concepts that he asked, there are 2 things I want to say about this passage as kind of beginning. The first of all is, the interesting thing is that the 7 virtues that are identified here, true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, gracious, excellence, anything worthy of praise. What this really is a list of Greek and Roman virtues. If you had studied the literature of 1st century Greco-Roman world, the virtues to which Paul is commending that they give their minds to are virtues that were shared not just by the Christian community, but by the whole empire, by all of those ancient cultures that had developed in Greece and in Rome. And what this suggests to me is that Christians need to realize that the source of all of our truth is the same God. That the descendants of Abraham, though they were given a wonderful glimpse into the uniqueness of God, and there is something about biblical religion that tells us that this one who wants to bless is an incredibly, incredibly trustworthy God. The truth is there have been many people who have been nurtured in traditions outside of the biblical tradition that are also in touch with a common foundation of values. And what I'm suggesting is that there are many moral codes beside the ones that you find in Holy Scripture. And there are great similarities. You've probably heard of the Code of Hammurabi. That was a very ancient moral code that has many parallels to the Ten Commandments. It originated 1,800 years before Christ in Babylon. The Egyptians came to some marvelous insights as they observed creation, and there was even an Egyptian king that believed that there was only one God long before Judaism made that the dominant tenet of Western civilization. All I'm saying is that we need to realize that though we have been given an incredible gift in the biblical vision of reality, that other people, because they were created by the same God, and because they live in a world that God has created, and because they have within them the same kind of capacities, that truth be told is we don't have to be arrogant and say we are the only ones that have the truth, because in terms of certain basic foundational moral issues, there is a tremendous consensus in many of the great cultures. And I think that's very important for us not to get smug and not to feel like that just because we have been given a wonderful, wonderful insight and gift that we should look with disdain and despising on other people. There is such a thing as natural revelation. That is, you can look at the creation and you can learn a great deal. And if you look at every significant religious system, I don't care where you find it in the world, you're going to find that there are certain things that are common. For example, what we call the Golden Rule, in some form or another, is found in every significant religious system. The wisdom of Confucius, it is found in the teachings of Muhammad. It is certainly basic to Old Testament and New Testament. And there is something, I think, almost innate in us because we're created by a single God that makes us say that this is in fact what is right and this is in fact what is wrong. Because what the Golden Rule really says is you ought to measure what you do to other people in light of what you yourself would like to have done to you and what you consider to be fair. For example, even a thief thinks it's wrong if he or she is robbed. I mean, let anybody be robbed and they will say to you, that is an abuse of the human power that we have. And any human being, I believe, would also respond positively when somebody does a just and true thing in relation to them. You may have read in the paper some time ago about a day laborer who'd gotten injured on a construction job. He was a very simple, uneducated man. And he was injured, and he had to stay off work for a while, and he filed a workman's compensation thing and was awarded a $4,500 award to pay the doctor and hospital bills that had accrued and to pay for his back pay. He was not a person who had a bank account. He was not that sophisticated. So when he got the check from the insurance company, he went to a neighbor next door and said, would you be willing to take me to somewhere where I can cash this check, and then I'll take the cash in the morning and I'll pay the hospital and I'll pay the doctor. And so the neighbor agreed, and so they went and cashed the check, and the man took all the cash. By this time it was late in the afternoon, and so the neighbor said, let me take you to dinner before we go back home. And so they go to some some steakhouse here. I think it was in Center Point. And so they have dinner, and the neighbor pays for it. Well, unbeknown to this simple man who was getting over this injury, during the meal, the billfold with that $4,500 that he had just gotten slipped out of his pocket and fell down on the floor. He was not even sophisticated enough to have a driver's license or any kind of identification. And he goes home and goes to bed and gets up the next morning. The same neighbor's going to take him to the doctor and take him to the hospital to pay off, and he can't find his billfold. Well, he's just absolutely distraught. And they go back to the bank, and they don't know anything about it. They search the neighbor's car, that they look all through the house. And then they remember that they'd eaten at this steakhouse. And so they went there, and they told the manager what had happened. And he asked a few questions to make sure the details corresponded. And he said, well, I've got good news for you. Said one of our oldest employees, a lady who's actually a grandmother. She's been working here for 25 years. She found that billfold on the floor last night, and she's turned it in, and here it is. And so he gives the man his billfold intact back. Well, he is so grateful that this had happened, because this was cash money and there was no identification. But he asked if he could see the lady who had done this, and so the manager calls her out. And he thanks her profusely for what she has done. And I'm told that that simple lady said, look, I have to work hard for my money. I live right on the edge of things. If I had lost my billfold, I would have really wanted whoever found it to have given it back to me. And I'm trying to live my life to others as I would like for them to, I'm trying to do for others what I would like for them to do to me. And it was a wonderful example of that innate sense that I think is part of what it means to be a human being and made in the image of God. And you're going to find people who have never heard about Moses. And you're going to find people who may have never heard the name Jesus, who nonetheless are at some deep intuitive level in touch with a kind of common morality. And my own sense is that we in the church would be much better served with the wonderful insights that we have been given into religious matters. We'd be much better served if we would be witnesses and gift givers of the truth that has been given to us, rather than being arrogant and saying we're the only ones that have the truth. You're wrong, we're right, we're up, you're down, because that always puts people on the defensive. I'm reading more and more today that there's a difference in many people's minds between religion and spirituality. And the distinction that people are making is that religion has this terrible tendency to get exclusive, to get dogmatic, to say we and we alone have the truth, whereas spirituality has a kind of openness to it, a kind of mystery that admits I have been given something and I'd like to give it to you. But I'm not going to be arrogant enough to say the way I have experienced truth is the only way that truth can be. Now, if you'll stop and think about it, none of us have been everywhere. None of us have experienced everything. None of us really have a right to say this is the only shape that truth can exist in. What we can do is say, I have found this to be true and helpful, and you have a right to know about it. And I hope you'll take this into account as you're making up your own understanding of truth. All Jesus ever asked us to be was a witness. Now, he didn't ask us to climb in the jury box and get the jury by the throat and demand that they agree with us. If you are called in court as a witness, your one obligation is to say under oath as honestly and clearly as you can your perception of the incident under discussion. It's not your job to make everybody come in line with what you think. And my sense is if we would offer the wonderful insights that we have been given through Jesus Christ, if we would offer these as a gift to people, and if we would say, this has been enormously enriching to my life, and you have a right to know this, and I want you to take this into account, people would respond, I think, more openly to a gift being offered that has the potential of enlarging their understanding than a person arrogantly saying, look, you're wrong, and I've come to set you right. You are mistaken, and I alone have the truth. If I had cancer and I took some medicine and it enabled me to recover from cancer, I would have every reason in the world to tell everybody I could find, look, this has really been the agent of my healing. There would be no limits on my desire to make everybody who might be suffering from cancer aware of what had happened to me. I don't have to walk out and say, this is the only medicine in the world that cures cancer, because I haven't been everywhere. I haven't experienced everything. So what I'm suggesting is that when St. Paul here is really giving a list that you could find in the Nicomachean Ethics, which was made famous by Aristotle, you could go to many of the Greek and Roman classics and find the qualities that he is commending here. Instead of saying, oh my goodness, these can't be right because they didn't originate from the same source where we get our truth, I think the better way is to celebrate that there is one God behind it all, one God who has created every person and has been the author of every fabric of reality. And therefore give thanks to those places where it is clear that the Creator is being revealed and being made known through the creation. So the list that he gives here of virtues is a list that has wide commonality. When Paul is speaking about distinctively Christian virtues, what he calls the fruits of the Spirit, he uses some different names like joy, peace, patience, self-control. But these are things that, because he was a human being living in that culture, he found to be true, and he offered that. The other thing I want to say about this before we get into specific looking at each one of the words is that St. Paul here is in touch with a very profound understanding of human nature in these words. Because what he says is, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, pure, lovely, gracious, excellent, worthy of praise, think about these things. Fill your mind with these particular things. And what is so significant about this is that he is acknowledging that to be human is to have a choice. That the misgenius of our human species is that you and I have genuine freedom. We are not totally free, but we are genuinely free. That is, in the things that we feel, in the things that we think, and in the things that we do. We are not victims. We are not rocks being pushed by some flood water. We're not leaves that are being totally blown about by some wind over which we have absolutely no control. But we do have a choice about the things we choose to think about the ideals that we pick that we will allow to shape our behavior. We're not free in terms of all the feelings that flood into our consciousness, but we do have a choice as to what we're going to do with those feelings. Martin Luther has what I think is a very wonderful metaphor that illustrates what I'm trying to say here and what I think St. Paul is saying. He says, I cannot keep the birds from flying over my head, but I can keep them from building a nest in my hair. In other words, I am not absolutely and totally free in terms of circumstances. Things come into my life that I did not originate, that I do not want. I have no control over all the possibilities that swirl about me intellectually, emotionally, the possibilities of my action. But I do have a choice as to what I'm going to do with the things that are done to me. I do have a choice about what I choose to fill my mind with, how I choose to sort out the many things that come upon me. And I think that he is in touch with something very primal about our human situation when he says, here are all kinds of options that are before you. These are not the only things you can think about or the only things you can feel. But these are things that you can choose, and if you choose it, it will give a certain shape to your life. So I really think that he is in touch with something very deep. Jesus said something very similar when he said, as a person thinks in his heart, so is he, so is she. You and I, in terms of what we finally do with our lives, we do have a choice. We are not totally free, but we are genuinely free. And what he is suggesting, I think, in this is that of the thoughts, the intellectual side of our lives, the feelings, and the possible actions that we have, our final freedom is to decide what we're going to do with what life is doing to us. And we can determine our response to the things that happen to us, even though we cannot fully determine what it is that happens circumstantially. Alfred Adler was one of the pioneers in modern psychology. He was a Swiss person. He tells a really interesting story that I've referred to before about a fateful meeting that took place in the Grand Railroad Station of Vienna, Austria, back in 1931. It seems that a well-dressed Austrian businessman got off a train, and as he was walking through the lobby of the station, he was stopped by an alcoholic beggar who asked him if he would give him enough money to buy breakfast. And the well-dressed man said, I don't usually respond to requests like this, but I will give you some money on one condition. Tell me, how did somebody as intelligent-looking as you appear to be allow himself to get into such a helpless state of affairs? And the beggar got red in the face and said, look, if you had happened to you what has happened to me, you would not be asking that question. You would be standing in my shoes. And then he said, I had never had a chance in life. He said, when I was born, my mother died not long after I was born, and my father turned out to be such a cruel and abusive man that the state had to finally step in and take me and my brothers and sisters away from my father and put us in a state-run orphanage. And he said, no sooner had I kind of gotten on my feet with that than World War I came along. And one night the fighting came right up to the campus of our orphanage, and they began to fire shells into the place, the dorm where we were living. And all of us had to scatter into the night to survive. I never saw my brothers and sisters again. I have no earthly idea where they are. He said, it's been like that all my life. Every time I get to my feet, I get knocked to the ground. He said, if you had happened to you what has happened to me, you wouldn't be asking that question. You'd be standing begging like I am. And the well-dressed stranger said, well, it's interesting you should say that, because as you tell your story, it has a real parallel to my own saga. He said, I was born into a family where my mother died when I was very young. My father was very abusive, and the state had to step in and take me and my brothers and sisters away from him. He said, I was in an orphanage, and World War I came, and it got bombed, and I got scattered and separated from my family. But he said, I always felt like I had the power to choose what I would do with the things that life had done to me. And the two began to talk more fully, and as you probably have already anticipated, they discovered that they were in fact blood brothers, separated over a decade before by the accidents of war, and now by some strange mystery of providence, their lives had intersected again. And Alfred Adler asked the question, why do individuals respond so differently to the same situation? Here were two people with the same genetic background. Here were two people with the same circumstantial kind of thing to deal with, and yet one had allowed the circumstances to absolutely decimate any sense of power. He'd become absolutely helpless and victimized, and the other had somehow found a way to tack into the wind and to use what seemed to be blowing against him as a way of propelling him forward. Now, why is it, he said, that two individuals respond so differently to the same set of circumstances? Well, of course, the answer is the very thing that St. Paul is talking about here. The answer is that gift and mystery of freedom that you and I have. The final freedom that Viktor Frankl speaks about. Not the freedom to determine what happens to us circumstantially, but the freedom to determine what we will think, how we will handle our feelings, and therefore what we will do to what life does to us. And it's the ongoing mystery of our species. George Buttrick once wrote, why does the same sunlight melt the wax and harden the clay? The same agent causes such a different reaction. Or Oscar Wilde has this famous couplet, two men looked through the self-same bars. One saw mud and the other stars. Both are there, both are resident in the situation before. And one pair of eyes chooses to gravitate down to the worst and the grimiest and the dirtiest. The other pair of eyes choose to gravitate up to the loveliest and the most sublime. Now, how do you account for that? Well, it goes back to this mystery of freedom that is the very essence, the very genius of our humanhood. And this is what this whole passage is about, is that you and I do have a choice in terms of what we will think, in terms of what we will do with our feelings, and how we will act. And as a person chooses to think, that is, what you choose to do with the birds that you can't keep from flying over your head, what you choose to do with the things over which you have no control, but you have some control about what they're going to do to you and what you're going to do to them, that is going to set the shape of your life. It's going to make a vast difference in the way that your existence unfolds. I remember years ago around Thanksgiving time, telling about something that happened to me in Fort Worth, Texas, when I was serving a parish there. It was a large parish, and one Wednesday afternoon I went to make my hospital calls, and I had about 5 people to see in that hospital that afternoon. And I did what I usually do. I take the elevator up to the top floor, and then I work my way down using the stairs. And on the 8th floor, I saw the name of a lady who I knew well. She was an older member of my church. I knew she had tremendous physical problems. And so no sooner had I sat inside the door than I began to try to empathize with her about having to be in the hospital. This was just about Thanksgiving time, so it was holiday season. And my empathy just called forth a gusher of complaints and grievances. She said, I hate having to leave home and come to the hospital. This is such a noisy place. You can't possibly get any rest. Every time you close your eyes, the door opens and somebody comes in asking something. She said the beds are just like concrete. The sheets, I think they're made of sandpaper. If I stay here long, I'm going to die of bed sores. The food, it is absolutely horrible. I can't stand being here. I hate it. And everything she said was true. There wasn't a factual error in any of her comments about her situation. She was an older lady. She was up against it. And she was in a place she didn't want to be that has its own characteristics that are sometimes awfully disruptive. And I did my best to offer her consolation. I tried to remind her that she was not alone, that God was closer than breathing, nearer than hands and feet. But to be honest, I don't think any of my consolation penetrated very deeply to this tremendous sense of resentment about these circumstances. And I offered a prayer. And I left, and I felt like a barracuda had hold of my jugular vein, because all of my energy had been. I felt so sorry for her. And you who have been in situations like this know that your helplessness to do anything for people is a pain of its own. I went on down, and I saw 2 other people, and on the 5th floor, I entered the room with another woman. I also knew her. And she was a woman about the same age as my 8th story person. She was pretty well up against the same kind of difficulties that go with aging. And so before I went in, I kind of steeled myself in saying, here we go again. And so I open the door, and I go in. And I promise you there was a genuine difference in the atmosphere of that room. I began to say, I know you're sorry to have to be in the hospital. And she said, well, to be honest, I do prefer being at home, but I have some problems that my family can't handle right now, and I am grateful that there are places like hospitals that I can come to. She said, the word hospital comes from the same word as hospitality, and said, I'm so glad that there are institutions that are willing to be hospital to somebody like me when I have my kind of problems. And I said, well, I'm sure it's hard to get any rest with all the commotion going back and forth in the hospital. She said, my family are wonderful, me at home, but both my son and my daughter-in-law work, and they're busy. And she said, I really get quite lonely. I get tired of television. She said, I love all these new people that come in and out of the room. She said, some of these student nurses are beautiful, and they're so cute, and they talk to me. She said, every time the door opens, I get excited because I think another surprise is going to come. I said, I guess the beds are not like home sheets. And she said, you know what? She said, we wash our sheets at home once a week. they wash them here every day. She said, I think that is real luxury, don't you? And I was really and truly getting absolutely amazed. And so I made one more run at trying to give her a chance to complain. And I said, well, I'm sure the food is not the same here as it is at home. And she said, I don't want to say anything against my daughter-in-law because she's a wonderful, wonderful cook. But she said she cooks the same things the same way all the time. And just to be honest, I get kind of bored. And she said, it's wonderful. It's wonderful to have a menu that is varied and different. And she said, of course, eating anywhere is very difficult for me because I only have 2 teeth left. But thank the Lord they hit. Well, when she said that last thing, well, thank the Lord they hit, I felt like standing back and saluting this lady. Because here was somebody who had chosen to take what she could not control and had chosen to find a way to be grateful and to make them work for her instead of against her. She didn't have a choice about being old. She didn't have a choice about being sick. She didn't even have a choice about being in the hospital, but she did have a choice as to what she did with what life was doing to her. And the whole genius of this passage is to remind us that though circumstances often victimize us, we don't have to be victims. The final freedom that any human being has is to choose how you're going to respond to what happens to you. And I have learned that not only from what I have seen in others, I've learned that from my own experience and the difference it makes. I've told you many times about the night after my little girl died that I couldn't sleep, and I went down in my study and I took down this 22nd chapter of Genesis where Abraham was asked to offer Isaac back as a sacrifice. And I've told you how in that commentary by Gerhard von Rad, he says that he thinks what God was trying to find out in that mysterious demand that he made of old Abraham. Did Abraham remember where Isaac had come from? Did he remember that Isaac was gift and not possession? Or had he become, in a sense, proprietary about something that had come to him from beyond his own deserving or creating? Did Abraham remember that life is gift? Well, as Abraham's behavior suggests, he did remember. He did not withhold even that one who was the most precious, because he knew in the deepest reaches of his being that everything comes from God and everything is a gift. Nothing is possession we have a right to hold on to. And when that broke over me that Laura Lou was in my life the way Isaac was in Abraham's life, when it came to me that life is gift, that every person is windfall, every person is grace, that's when it dawned on me that there in that dark valley of the shadow of grief that I had a choice. I could spend the rest of my life being angry and resentful and sad that Laura Lou only lived 10 years and didn't fulfill her potential. I could spend the rest of my life having a grudge against God because of what didn't seem to be fair. Or I could spend the rest of my life being grateful that she'd ever been given it all, that I had a single day in the gladness of her presence. It came almost visible to me that there were 2 roads out of that dark place: the road of resentment that only led into deeper darkness, and the road of gratitude that led back to the one who had given the good old days and could therefore be counted on to give good new days. And it dawned on me I had a choice. And the difference between the road of gratitude and the road of resentment, the difference is going to take you further than those 2 older women in the hospital were separated. Because to learn to be grateful for what we have instead of resentful for what we don't have or what has been taken away, it changes the way you look at everything. So, if you don't remember anything else I've said tonight, please hear that the genius of who you are as a creature is that you have been given the mystery of freedom. You can't keep the birds from flying over your head, but you can keep them from building a nest in your hair. You can't control completely all the thoughts that flood in, all the feelings that come, all the possibilities of action, but you can determine what you're going to fill your mind with, what you're going to focus on, what out of all the ambiguity of what is before us, you can pick out what you're going to maximize and what you're going to minimize. And you can deal with feelings because there's something bigger in you than what you feel. And out of that is going to come the shape of your personhood. Okay, with these two things said about it, let me just quickly now identify with you, for you, the 7 virtues that St. Paul found to be so significant. And I'm going to try very quickly to give you an illustration, a personal illustration of each one of these, because I think we see truth better through narrative and picture than maybe abstract concept. He begins by saying, finally, brethren, whatever is true, think about these things. Every culture that I know of will suggest that the dividing line between immaturity and maturity is when truth, reality-based perceptions become the things that you most want. Only the truth can bless. Because reality is finally that substance in which we have to live our lives. The opposites of what is true is obvious. The things that are false, the things that are illusory, fantasies, specious, anything that is not of reality, if we try to base our lives upon it, is going to disappoint us. It's going to let us down. It doesn't have the substance to support us. Only the truth can bless. And so I think he is in touch with the wisdom of every culture when he says, first and foremost, as you're choosing what you're going to let enter your mind as thought, and is therefore going to shape your action, let truth be your beginning point. Only the truth can bless. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the lady that's done so much research in the dying process, says that she thinks almost always dying people know what is happening to them, that they have that sense as no one else because they're living inside their own skin. And many times those people want to talk about this. They want to finish their business. They want to unpack their hearts. They have things they want to say and they want to deal with. But Kubler-Ross says that because we, the family, are so uncomfortable with the shape of that truth, that we're about to run out of time and that something is going to end because we don't want it to. Something's going to end and we don't want it to. That because we have such trouble embracing the truth, which is so painful in that moment, that we try to deflect the dying's attention. We say, oh, don't talk like that. We turn their attention to other things, and thus we relegate the dying to the burden of loneliness in light of everything else that they're having to bear. In situations like that, if we could only realize that only the truth can bless, and being willing to acknowledge the way it is as they're trying to acknowledge, and to deal with that and to help them to deal with it, that is way and away the most loving thing that we could possibly do. So this, I don't have to argue the obvious. Truth is finally the way it is, and truth is the only thing we have to live with ultimately. And giving each other the truth is like giving each other real money versus counterfeit money. And you do me the greatest act of love if you always deal truthfully and honestly with me as you're handling reality. The difference between a prejudice and a conviction, I am convinced, is that a conviction rests on what one seems and believes to be true. Prejudice is making up our minds ahead of time. It's letting our desires and wishes and fantasies get mixed in with the way it is. And people of prejudice rarely change their minds, notice, but people of conviction, because their greater desire is for truth, are capable of changing their mind. I read once that when Gandhi was the Prime Minister of India, that he took one position on one occasion. 2 weeks later he took a very different position, and a young idealist that was working with him said, Mr. Gandhi, you have no integrity. I heard you say this 2 weeks ago, now you're taking a very different position. How do you account for that? And Gandhi said, it's very simple. I've learned something since 2 weeks ago. A truth has been added to my perception, and I'm more interested in the truth than I am in being consistent. I'm more interested in the truth and I am proud. And so the first thing to choose to let enter your thought as an ideal and to shape your behavior is to find out of all the things that are before you what is the truest true. Where is the incredible all-rightness of the way it is? And then make that more than anything else important as you're shaping your thought. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are honorable. In the old King James, this had to do with things that were honest. The Greek word comes from an adjective that describes things that pertain to the gods and to the temples. An honorable thing is worthy of reverence. It is venerable. It is noble. It is serious. It is dignified. The opposites would be flippant, cheap, sacrificial. And if I need to give you an image for what is truly honorable, think of the waitress out here at Center Point who could have used $4,500, but who chose to do in that moment what she would to God that somebody else would have done if the roles had been reversed. And that is a genuinely honorable kind of thing to do. And I need to feed my mind on heroes and heroines like her and like Gandhi. And I need to remind myself that out of all the things that I could think, to think of those things that are honorable is something that I really choose to do. Finally, brethren, whatsoever is just. This is a term that means we give to God and to others their just due. It means duty-faced and duty done. To be just, which is something that all of us want other people to. An icon of justice that comes to my mind is one of the great early coaches of college football, Alonzo Stagg. He coached for many years at the University of Chicago. He was known as a great student of the game and somebody who could teach young men how to play football, but he was known even more as being incredibly honest and incredibly just. In fact, one day in a tight game, when the score was tied, one of his players broke clear and scored a touchdown. And if you can believe this, I know in our culture it's hard, but if you can believe it, Alonzo Stagg, the coach of the team that had just gone ahead, calls the referee and draws him over and says, "My man stepped out of bounds at this place. You can see it there. You can see his footprint on the sideline. You need to call it back." Now that is incredible, incredible. Just something was more important to Alonzo Stagg than his side winning. Now he had such a reputation for being honest that one time, and this was way back before things were so organized, the referees didn't show up. And so both teams agreed that he could be the referee. That is, that he could call the game that would control his side and their side, because they knew that more important than having his own way was being reality-based. More important than getting what he wanted at somebody else's expense was that there be a basic fairness. Would to God that we had him back, in the world of sports. So I don't want to get off on this, but I don't see why they don't reintroduce the instant replay that they used to have, because in making decisions about things that matter in baseball and in football, the better evidence you have, the more evidence you have, the better decisions you make. And I can see no reason why that today, when everything is on film, if a 12-year-old kid reaches over and catches a ball that the player should have caught and everybody sees it, why couldn't the umpire that made the mistaken call, why couldn't he admit that? I just have to admit I'm a great Braves fan. And the other night, when I forget who it was on third base and a long fly ball was hit, and he I swear to God, he stayed until the ball had been caught. And then he scored, and then later they called him out because they said he started too fast, and they replayed it, and the call was completely wrong. Why can't we use all the efforts we have in trying to be just? We've come a long way from the day of Alonzo Stagg. We've come a long way from the kind of idealism I grew up on. At our sports banquet when I was in high school, they always quoted Grantland Rice. It's not whether you win or lose, but how you play the game. But unfortunately, that has been superseded by Vince Lombardo Winning is not everything, it is the only thing. And that is going to be the corruption of our culture, because we long for justice and fairness when it's what's being done to us. And unless that becomes what we allow to enter our minds, everybody's going to suffer. What's finally, brethren, whatsoever is pure, this has to do with something undefiled, unmixed. This means something that would be fit to take into God's presence, something to be used in His service. The opposite of pure is something sordid, shabby, soiled, smutty. A pure person is one who has worked through his or her motives enough till they really want a single thing, and they're dedicated to a single purpose. And they're people like Nathaniel, as Jesus said, that in whom there is no guile. That they have no conflicting interest. They really are absolutely unmixed in what they do. I remember reading about a simple holy man that had an angel appear to him one night and said, "You found favor in God's eyes. He wants to give you whatever it is you most want. Make a request." And the holy man said, I really don't have any request to make. The grace of God is so wonderful. The way it is perfectly, perfectly satisfactory. I don't need anything else. He said, "No, you've got to ask something of God. You've got to make a request." And so he said, well, if I've got to make a request, let it be this. Let me do good for other people without knowing it. And so the story is that wherever that simple holy man went, behind his back where his shadow fell, sick people were healed, weary people were refreshed, cynical people were made hopeful again. He never knew anything about it. It's a wonderful, wonderful image of purity. Now, over against that is a story about a French politician who was renowned in that country because he was the proponent of every liberal political program. He was known as the champion of the underdog. He was always taking up against the corporations and against government for the little people. And one night after work, he's out taking his evening stroll by a river that ran close to his house. And as he was out strolling, he hears this commotion, and there's a young woman out in a canoe that somehow has hit something, and her canoe is capsized, and she doesn't know how to swim. And she's crying out for help, and she's going down once and going down twice, and the famous champion of the underdog just stands there and watches her go down for the third time, and then everything gets silent, and she's drowned. And he goes back home, and he finds himself wondering, why did I do nothing in that situation? But was it because I was afraid? No. Was it that I didn't know how to save somebody? No. He had courses in lifeguard. Why, he said, in that moment did I do nothing? And suddenly it struck him, and it was a shameful thought, that he had done nothing that night because there was no audience. Nobody would have known what he had done. And lo and behold, all of his alleged activities in behalf of the underdog were done because of the spotlight, were done because what other people would think, that when left to himself and what he would do, if nobody else knew about it, he did nothing. Purity is what you do in the dark. It's what you do when nobody else will ever know because your motives are unmixed. The next quality is something that Paul calls lovely. Other words for it are attractive, winsome, charming. It's the kind of behavior that evokes love. When you see this quality in somebody else, you instinctively love it. There is something inherently attractive and appealing about it. If you need an image of whatsoever things are lovely. I can't think of a better one than the story about a little 6-year-old boy who had his parents and the doctor come to him one day and said, "Your brother has a very, very rare blood disease, and he very much needs to have a transfusion. And we have checked, and you're the only one that has the same kind of blood that matches his. Would you be willing for us to take your blood and put it into your brother's veins because it would save his life?" And the little boy said, "Yes, of course, I'll do that." And so they put them side by side on 2 tables. They stick in the needle, and they take out a pint of the little 6-year-old's blood, and they put that straight into the veins of his sick brother. And when the procedure is finished, the little boy who had given the blood looked at the doctor with total innocence and said, "When am I going to die?" And it suddenly dawned on them that he thought that he was going to give his life, and he still did it. He thought he was giving all of his blood, and he still consented. The hardest thing in the world to give away is that kind of loveliness, because when you see it, it evokes in you a desire to do for others as you've seen somebody else do. Loveliness procreates itself. Kindness, when given, has a way of calling forth kindness in others. And whatsoever things are lovely, or anything you see that makes you want to love the person that did it and makes you want to love to do a similar thing. Whatsoever things are gracious, notice that these characteristics are certainly intertwined. There's not a tight boundary between them. The old King James said, whatsoever things are a good report, whatsoever things are godlike, whatsoever things are fitting to be given to God. The opposite of this would be ugly and harsh and destructive. Something that is gracious is when you give somebody more than they deserve. I think of Jesus on the cross being treated like an animal, and he dares to say, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Giving them the grace of a second chance, giving them the grace of a larger understanding of what they were doing. I think of the bishop in that wonderful musical Les Miserables, who had the embittered criminal stay in his house one night, and Jean Valjean, in his cynicism, steals the old bishop's silver, and he's caught, and it's brought back to the house. And the police say to the bishop, "We've caught this man. He was stealing your silver." And the old bishop, out of the goodness that is pure grace, said, "He didn't steal it. I gave it to him." And then he goes over and says, "Here's the other candlestick. You forgot to take it." And Jean Valjean is so astonished at goodness being returned for evil that he doesn't know what to say. And then the old bishop said, "I've given you more than a silver candlestick, my son. I'm giving you back your soul. Giving you something you don't deserve, but I'm giving it to you out of grace." King David did the same thing for the son of his great friend Jonathan. The son was named Mephibosheth. When Jonathan and Saul were killed, his grandfather and his father, a nurse picked up this little baby, and in her haste to try to flee, she dropped him, and both of his legs were broken, and he became a cripple for the rest of his life. And as soon as King David ascended the throne, the first thing he did was to send for this crippled child of his old friend Jonathan, and he said, "I want you to sit at my table every meal for the rest of your life. You are not my blood son, but you are my friend's son." And I heard somebody say once that they could just see David's great hall where people would come in dressed in finery. And here would come a son and a daughter, and here would come the captain of his, and then you'd hear a clump, 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 and here come the crutches, and here come the cripple, who sat down at the king's table, not because he deserved it, because the king was gracious. Mephibosheth knew the meaning of the word grace. The last, and this is a double thing, the last of the 7 qualities, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, then think on these things. St. Paul is saying here that certain actions are rightly proportioned. Certain actions are the kinds of things that fit exactly what is needed. Any excellence, anything worthy of praise, is the kind of action that any decent person, any perceptive person, that would affirm if one saw it happening. Not unlike the gracious things I've talked about, not unlike the acts of kindness, but excellence and praise are those things that are wonderfully proportioned or wonderfully appropriate. And my final image of what this would look like if you saw it in a person is a story about a man who was walking through a heavily populated tenement one day, and a little Volkswagen brakes didn't work, and the man inadvertently ran over a child who lived there in the tenement, and the little car wound up resting on the child. This man, in a moment of absolute impulsive kindness, rushed out and picked up with his own bare hands the little Volkswagen. Other people pulled the child out from under and rushed him to the hospital, and it was that quick, impulsive act that enabled the life of the child to be saved. Well, word got out, and they found the man, and a television station was so interested that they asked him to come back and reproduce the act that he had done to save the child's life. And of course, outside the emergency, he didn't have the strength. But what he did in that moment was perfectly appropriate to what needed to be done. And it's a symbol to me that we're given by God the strength to do what needs to be done. As our days, so will our strength be. That when we do those things that are wonderfully, wonderfully appropriate, those are the things that are worthy of excellence and are worthy of praise. And it all comes back to what I want you to leave with as a shining, shining realization. You have a choice. If you'll fill your mind, if you'll handle your feelings, if you will shape your behavior with these kinds of qualities and these kinds of ideals, if you will let this be what you feed on, then the way you think and how you choose to think is going to shape how you behave. I can't keep the birds from flying over my head, but I can keep them from building a nest in my hair. I can't control what happens, but I can control how I respond. I am not a victim, though many times I'm victimized. You always have a choice, and I bid you, let the best we know of each other and the best we know of God